Okay, would like to talk about Chapter 2 of The Fabric of Reality by David Deutsch. Remember, Chapter 1 was all about David Deutsch outlining a potential theory of everything, and in his view this is likely to come about through an amalgamation, a bringing together of elements from four branches, four areas of study. The four branches are quantum mechanics, computing, epistemology, and evolution. And in his view, we can only gain a true understanding of reality, of the fabric of reality, by diving deep and figuring out how we can explain various phenomena that we observe and what is causing the phenomena to exist in the way they do, and what this says about the true objective world all around us. He comes to the conclusion in Chapter 2 that we live in a multiverse. And for him, this is not just a mathematical conception, it's not theoretical. He seems to believe that the multiverse is actual, that there are parallel universes all around us, perhaps trillions, that we cannot see, we cannot directly measure, but we can see the indirect effects and influence of in a particular set of experiments involving shining laser lights through slits. And in Chapter 2, he discusses what these experiments were and why he has come to the conclusion that we only see a tiny slither, a tiny slice of reality, and that there's a much bigger picture. There are many, perhaps infinite number of universes in which different things are happening. And for him, so let me talk about the experiment. So the experiment to start with, so imagine you have a piece of opaque card, so no lights can get through, and you have two slits in this piece of opaque card. You shine a laser through and you see what pattern emerges on the screen behind. Now just think about that. What would you expect that pattern to be like if we shine a light at two slits and look at the resultant image on the screen? Contrary to common sense, what we actually get is a pattern. We get a series of light and dark regions. We don't get two light regions, as one might expect if we're shining light through two slits and surrounded by dark. We get a series of dark and light patches on the projector. Now, if we add another two slits, something interesting happens. We don't simply get the same pattern shifted to the left or to the right. What one might predict based on common sense is that the same pattern that emerges with two should be there when we have another two if they're equidistant. They are all the same distance apart, and so one might expect a second image to be imposed upon the original if we simply double the number of slits. But this is not the case. What we actually get, the pattern is very different. The pattern changes. And many physicists are trying to explain, or have tried to explain, why this is the case. And one possible explanation was that perhaps when we send laser light through all four slits, perhaps they are these photons. You can think of light as tiny balls, tiny packages of lights, and perhaps these billiard balls are going through at the same time and they're bumping into one another, they're colliding such that they're producing these strange patterns on the screen. That was one possible explanation. Now, I forgot to mention there was one really strange fact that happened when we went from 2 to 4. So when we had 2, we had a pattern of dark and white patches, but strangely, the white patches that were there when we had 2 slits went dark when we introduced 2 more. And this is why the experiment is quite weird. So we have light and dark, we add 2 slits, and the light regions now disappear. So the photons are no longer hitting those same regions when we have 4 slits. And scientists thought, okay, perhaps the photons that we're sending through are bumping into one another and there's some kind of interference occurring, and this is producing the strange patterns. Scientists took a further step and they said to themselves, okay, well, what would happen if we just sent 1 photon at a time through the apparatus? What pattern would we then get? So they fired, let's say, 1 photon per second and waited a few hours to see the resultant picture, the resultant pattern emerge. And what they discovered was that the pattern that emerges when you send just 1 photon at a time is identical, is the same as the pattern that emerges when you send laser light continuously. And this was also the case when we had 4 slits. So now we have 4 slits, we're sending 1 photon at a time. And after, say, 24 hours, we have lots of dots where the photons are striking the screen, and it produces exactly the same pattern, the same image as it did when we were firing trillions of photons at the same time, continuously. This rules out the possibility that the photons being sent out at the same time, when we had the continuous laser lights, they can't be bumping into one another and interfering and producing the pattern that we see, because we're only sending 1 photon at a time. So that begs the question, why are these photons only hitting certain places? And why do those places change when we go from 2 to 4? Why is it that when we open up another 2 slits, that a different pattern emerges, even when we're only sending 1 photon at a time? This is deeply mysterious and puzzling. The conclusion that David Deutsch arrives at is that when we send 1 photon at a time and we have 4 slits, or if we have 2 slits, he argues that the fact that there are these strange patterns emerging must be because we're sending more photons than we can see or that we can observe. So he argues that when 1 photon is going through, there are perhaps trillions of intangible photons, counterparts, also being sent through simultaneously, so that there are trillions going through, and invisibly, we can't see them, we can't detect them, but they're going through at the same time. This is when we send 1 photon. So 1 photon, but in these parallel universes all around us, beyond our perception, we can't touch these parallel universes, but he argues that we can see the effects, we can see the interference, we can see the influence, because when we send 1 photon, we're actually sending trillions, possibly for every single possible outcome is actually occurring simultaneously in parallel universes, and the interference patterns are the result of the interference of parallel universes. And he really comes to this conclusion because we're only sending 1 at a time. So why is it that we have these patterns? Why are photons not moving to where we would expect them to hit on the screen? And why is it that where we have white patches with 2 slits, we now have dark patches. Even when we send one photon through the apparatus, it's almost like the photons are being affected by simple opening of two slits where nothing is going through. Nothing is going through these two slits every single time, because the photon just goes through one of the slits each time. So it can't be the case that there's any kind of interference or bombardment or collisions with the photons that we're sending, the visible photons that we can measure and observe. He argues it must be the case that there's an invisible stream of intangible photons causing the pattern to emerge. Not every physicist agrees that we live in a multiverse. Many argue that we simply don't really understand what's going on. This is related to Schrodinger's wave function equation, and it has puzzled physicists like Einstein for decades, and they haven't really come to an agreed consensus on what is really going on and how we can explain these spooky, strange phenomenon like these interference patterns. And one of the things I got from this book is that reality, and especially quantum mechanics, is deeply strange, and there's a lot of argument, a lot of debates within the field in trying to explain these various phenomena. And I think the big takeaway from chapter 2 is that there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't really understand what's going on in terms of the fabric of reality and the true nature of the world. We can't really explain with any degree of confidence what is actually happening in terms of mechanical operations and scientific processes. We're kind of just guessing, and scientists, perhaps depending on their own brain, because it seems to me that the intuitives like Michio Kaku, certainly David Deutsch, they are more comfortable with this idea of the multiverse, and they don't mind postulating that, you know, there are all of these parallel universes affecting our results, whereas the more pragmatic, factual based minds, the ones that perhaps prefer realism and things that we can measure, they deny the existence of these invisible worlds all around us. And very enjoyable to read, not easy. I had to read chapter 2 about 4 or 5 times actually to really understand what David Deutsch was trying to explain about the deeply puzzling nature of quantum mechanics and what this tells us about the world in general and as a product of these processes, and why these processes are occurring in the way they do. So hopefully I've explained it so that it makes sense. There's plenty of videos on YouTube which you can watch to demonstrate some of these slit experiments. Deeply fascinating. There is a video of David Deutsch talking about this as well, so I would encourage anyone to go to YouTube, listen to him explain the phenomenon of interference patterns and why he has come to the conclusion that indeed there is a multiverse all around us. Thanks for watching.